I can do whatever I want to. It's a free country. Although this is the last retort of many a playground argument, it's a sentiment felt deeply by many adult Americans as well. But like all handed down attitudes, it's healthy to question them from time to time. My next guest is a cultural anthropologist who has studied American society for 20 years. He's also the author of Our Worst Strength, American Individualism and Its Hidden Discontents. Today we're going to investigate the impact of endless options and convenience as we ask the question, is American individualism overrated? Societal explorer, academic refugee, Dr. James F. Richardson. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to have this conversation because American individualism is something that I considered definitely a strength, a beautiful feature of we Americans. And as I read your book and prepared for our conversation, now I have mixed thoughts and feelings. So I'm so glad you're here to be my Sherpa through those. So I thought we would start off by visiting some maybe telling historical figures that might be informing our thoughts today. So there's two that I want to share with you and get your thoughts on. The first one is the American cowboy. He is on a horse in the middle of nowhere. He hunts his own dinner. He makes his own bullets. Rugged individualism. That's his prototype. That's his brand. The second is the American businesswoman. She is a widow or a divorcee who has used her life savings to start a risky business because the bank wouldn't loan her any money. She succeeds with elbow grease and a smile. Despite not having support, she is the overcomer. So from your point of view, which is a cultural anthropology point of view, how much are these characters kind of the archetypes of how we view our own individualism today?
Well, you picked two really good ones. I think one is the cowboy's overhyped in film. And I think the older you are, the more that's the reigning archetype. I'm so glad you brought up the businesswoman, or we'll just call it the business person. And I think today the founder entrepreneur seems to be what a lot of people aspire to be, coming right out of school. So I think that's the more dominant one because it relates to this old theme in American history of the inventor.
Right.
So it starts with Eli Whitney, who invented the cotton gin. When I was in school, that's all I learned. I wasn't even taught in the textbook what the cotton gin did, or I didn't remember. It made slave plantations vastly more profitable. Oops, that's awkward.
Sometimes history's awkward. You just got to look it in the eye.
But in an individualistic society post-World War II, where everybody's getting a lot more autonomy than they used to have, history was rewritten with this bias. So when we talk about Eli Whitney, it's the cotton gin. Ooh, he made cotton cleaning more efficient. That's awesome. There was no discussion of the context, what the consequences were for society. And with founders and inventors, we focus on the founding. If you go to LinkedIn, I'm on LinkedIn all the time for my business, and I can't tell you how many posts are about starting things. I founded this. We're about to found this. I just got into this retailer. Everything's the beginning of something. Because that's how we think. We're like, I, the individual, have this thing, and there's all this upside. And we tend to interpret the whole world that way and focus on those stories. We don't focus on 90% of entrepreneurs who go belly up. Some lose a lot of money, like all of it. That doesn't lead to stuff. And so someone has to clean up that personal mess, right? The financial mess. The immediate family figures it out in most cases. But we focus on the upside. And I think that's really great if you want to motivate yourself. We have lots of motivational content. But unlike a really communitarian society, which would be much more risk averse, people would be asking all sorts of questions. And they would probably prevent you from doing things. Like the midlife woman from starting her own business, that would just get stopped. Right? So we have this dilemma, which is that we want to free people up to pursue their dreams and passions, but we don't really talk about the whole process. We really don't talk about failure. And how do we deal with that? And I end my book by talking about this. We have a problem. We don't ritualize failure. The closest thing I've heard about is divorce parties, which my 80-year-old mother still thinks are god-awful.
I mean, I would have liked one, but that's neither here nor there.
Right, but that's an example of the impulse of we've got to handle the failure, right?
Well, I think if I'm hearing between the lines, I don't know if that's a thing, but we'll make it a thing today. If I'm hearing between the lines of what you're saying is we can credit to some degree that spirit of individualism as the thing that makes a person look at a problem and then look around them and go, you know what? This has never been done before, and yet I will do it. And that's where we have innovation. But what I'm hearing you say in between the lines is that we don't often stop to think, how will this innovation, if I fail or if I succeed, affect the people around me, those closest to me, but also society at large, which you pointed out with the example of the cotton gin.
Yeah, I mean, that's a kind of a creepy example. A more recent one that Jonathan Haidt's written about is a smartphone. Apple just sends it out by the millions. Who knows? It'll be fun.
Yeah.
It had some good features, it has some horrendous ones. But we don't live in a society which wants to, gate innovation, technological innovation, based on, well, let's do a 10-year study on potential social impact. Now, we could run our country that way. Absolutely. There's nothing stopping us.
Yeah.
But that's not American.
Yeah, that's interesting. We do have bias towards industrialism, towards full speed ahead. Oh, 5G, yeah, let's do it. Okay, Starlink, yeah, let's do it. Self-driving cars, that's a great idea.
Everything's great. It's funny. I was just on another show and I mentioned that AI seems to be the first massive technological multi-decade revolution where Congress seems to be way ahead of the curve. They're already talking about how to regulate it. And it doesn't even work, Meredith. I mean, it doesn't even work that well yet.
Congress doesn't work
No,
well?
well, we know that. But the AI, it doesn't even work that well. And they're already starting to talk about how do we regulate this and gate it and control the beast. That's actually pretty impressive. Usually with the smartphone, we just wake up and wait for academics to do studies.
Well, you use the word gate, which is, I think when people think of the opposite of individualism, they think of restriction, like restricting our ability to create and build, move, and even think. And that's where we get into this hey, it is my God-given right. And there's a link always between God-givenness and Americanness for whatever reason. And so then we have this visceral response against restriction. But is the opposite of individualism restriction?
No. Well, I mean, I mean, that's what a philosopher would tell us, right? And an anthropologist would say the opposite of our society is a highly conservative, Amazonian tribe, right? Where we really don't care what your opinion is as an individual about much. We're trying to get stuff done for the group. But I think there's something in the middle that we could create. We have to step back and realize that we've been experimenting with this degree of autonomy for a very short period of time. And I talk in my book in chapter 1 literally about how we unlocked all these lifestyle choice variables that were, honestly, even for my 80-year-old parents, most of them were locked. Like this idea that you don't have to get married, you don't have to have kids. They didn't grow up with that belief. I mean, it wasn't even a choice in their brain. You just do it, right?
Yeah.
So we've got all this autonomy, and I think the question is, we've now had several decades to play around with it. And I wrote the book because it's like, well, why don't we step back and figure out where do we inject a little more order? So back to the businesswoman, the midlife businesswoman. Now, if she's living her own, spending her own money, and she's divorced, maybe go for it. But she should also be encouraged by society to have a financial plan for the failure. When I started my business and left corporate America, that's exactly what I did. I did an Excel spreadsheet because I'm a dork. Literally, no, seriously, what are the minimum expenses we could go down to keep the house? That's how crazy and pessimistic it was. That was very useful because it actually gave me more encouragement. Most people don't do that, though, when they start businesses. They don't even do really solid business plans, a lot of entrepreneurs. They don't raise enough money. They don't even understand personal finance. So, I mean, I think there's ways that society can let people pursue these things, but in a more responsible manner, meaning they won't become a social burden when they fail.
Interesting. And so I can see where this work, commerce, success department is the low-hanging fruit of this example, because that's where we see that individualistic spirit succeed most publicly and fail most publicly.
I got to correct you, though. It fails mostly in private. See, this is the problem, is that, I mean, just go look at the cover of Entrepreneur and Inc. Are they interviewing people who lost their life savings in their home?
That's true.
They're only going to cover those if the second business was, Apple.
Right, right.
So it's just,
Very good point.
I got trained later in life in statistics, and this is a problem in how the media presents case studies, right? And it's very easy to go cherry pick anecdotes that tell you a story you want to hear. I think we could be more responsible as a society. You have a business license from your local state, right? That required how many people to supervise you filing that application?
None.
Right.
I did ask for my husband's help, to be fair.
There you go. Right. Most of us are smart enough to get some people involved. But basically, there isn't really some council of elders who's willing to actually weigh in on, wait, do you even have a business plan that works? Let's look at your business plan, and we'll give you a business license, but it's sort of like a book review. It's like a book prize. Like they'll read your book, you didn't get it, and they'll send you 2 pages of notes on why your book sucked. That's actually useful.
Oh, okay.
That makes the application fee for the book prize worth it.
So are you suggesting that we could both be more successful as individuals and benefit society in more instances than not? If when going on these very stereotypical American adventures, if we took a pause and tried to involve our community, is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, and if the community was actually set up to give what I would call dispassionate, smart advice, as opposed to what we have now, which is LinkedIn. I spam people for advice.
No, you bring up a great point because, like, historically, we were more likely to ask our neighbors for help. We would need their help to fix a motor, watch a child. We would need an ingredient, the old adage about borrowing a cup of sugar. But now we have apps for that. And so we can Uber Eats and DoorDash and go on Reddit and go on YouTube and learn how to fix our vehicles. And we don't really need our community in the way that we used to.
Correct. So to build on that, Meredith, we've come to unconsciously believe that it's optional. And so it's going to be the last place you necessarily think about going when you're starting a business. You might go to your friends, your family, although I think most of us who start a business realize that family still plays its primordial role, which is to tell you don't do this.
Yeah.
So the best solution is actually to have rituals and systems in local communities where the application for the business like your license triggers a series of stage gate checks, right? Just to help you, right? Not to stop you, but you can't get the license unless you go through them. I mean, I could hear the groaning and whining, mostly from guys who just want to get their license done, but this doesn't have to be that onerous. And the statistic that we all know, and it's actually really bad in the industry that I advise in, that 95% of founders fail. It rolls off everybody's tongue, but we don't. No, I hear nobody saying, well, why can't we get that down to 50%?
Right.
Because the idea is, well, if you're a true genius, you'll be in the 5%. You'll be the This is why we don't ask that question.
You're right. Okay, I'm seeing the picture that you're painting right now is you're not saying, oh, hey, we have this incredible fail rate. How about we lower it? You're saying it's almost like inviting people to be that 5% that succeeds. 95% fail rate, wink, wink, you're going to be the 5. It's not like, hey, let's do something different.
Right. And what I'm suggesting, and that's why I don't have a lot of friends, is that we want 95% of the people to fail, because otherwise it wouldn't be cool.
Oh, wow. You just took it to another level.
We actually, deep down, we want that disaster to be true, because then it makes it even all the more cool.
Interesting.
And I think that's a very American definition of success, is that we were the magic genius that made it through the funnel, and we tend to project that backwards onto inventors and entrepreneurs. And I was just talking about this yesterday with somebody, Lay's potato chips, we've all eaten it. That was started by a snack food manufacturer in the Depression. So the Depression kind of flew by. You didn't notice it. He was rich. Okay. He's already rich. And then on the back of that cash flow starts a potato chip plant because he thought he had something pretty cool. Everyone's forgotten the wealth and all the privilege and the manufacturing assets he had to do this experiment. So he gets re-narrated as some dude, some generic American entrepreneur. It wasn't generic at all. He was super rich. Herman Lay was a rich guy.
Interesting. I am replaying every motivational talk I've ever absorbed at every business conference I've ever been to, and this is giving me new light. What's the connection between beliefs around privacy and beliefs around individualism?
So Americans have a very specific view of shame. I think because we are in our own fishbowl, most of us haven't lived in a society that's honor-based or family-based or centered around family honor. And so we don't understand how shame traditionally works in human cultures, because it generally works about you embarrassing the group. That's what historically how shame functions in most societies. But we have this individualist shame. And so that shame is all about my personal failure, right? So a classic one is my startup failed. There's enormous shame around them. We have a privacy belief in America that shields people from a lot of nosy inquiry, even from friends and family, right? So that you can hide those kinds of personal shame, that kind of personal shame based on your individual missteps or whatever it is, whatever it was, very, very easily. And we don't ask about deeply, potentially shameful things. If someone quits their job or switches jobs, we don't go in and we ask people, yeah, but did you get laid off, resigned? I mean, put it into 3 buckets, please. It's like,
Oh, yeah.
we just hang back, right? Oh, we don't want to go there. Now, there's a lost opportunity for communal connection and support, right? The worst example I talk about in my book is domestic violence. I interviewed a woman for the book. I didn't cite her story, but this is a woman who was physically and emotionally abused for 20 years in a marriage and never told her best friend about what was going on and never told her mother once. These are people she saw all the time. She spent more time disguising the abuse from them than trying to find a way to bond with them because she was ashamed of being in this situation. So I think that's a classic example where American notions of privacy actually perpetuate hell for people.
And there's an idea that when something bad happens to you, it's your own fault, which I think is an idea, perhaps you tell me, tied to individualism.
It's very much tied to this kind of Scottish Anglo-Saxon notion of Christian, whatever you want to call it, of radical personal responsibility. Then for that to make sense as a belief system, you have to be responsible for your failures and your success. Unconscious.
It's interesting that all of this affects mental health in a way that I had never considered before. And yet, especially with younger generations, maybe everyone but like boomers and older, that they are so much more open to mental health services. And yet, in the research study that you quoted in your book, a large number of Gen Xers and boomers still prefer to think through and solve their life problems alone.
Yeah, I mean, they represent this, what I would call mid to late 20th century peak of individualism, unquestioned individualism, right? It's before we were having interviews like this. No one questioned it, right? So I think
there's no platform.
What's interesting, yeah, well, no, but you just didn't go there. And the people who are most wounded by these issues of I'm trapped in a prison of my own privacy, right? They didn't have a voice. Women who were being sexually assaulted and abused. It's a classic example. We're still moving through that as a society. How do we get people empowered to say what actually happened to them so the community can then intervene? Will they be believed? Is an even bigger issue, but I think if you don't say anything, you're hiding behind that primal shame, which is very Western. And it's a different kind of shame than like a rape survivor in India experiences. Their shame is actually it's about dishonoring the family by being assaulted, which is even more bizarre.
I think in part we have American individualism to credit for the rise in those individual rights, for human rights, women's rights. I mean, so I'm kind of going back and forth with the thought experiment that American individualism is overrated. And what kind of brings me back to the side that it is something to be celebrated is the example that you just brought up, the part that we would consider the rights of a woman because she as an individual person is important. The rights of a worker who is perhaps underage as important as a person, even though they're contributing to society by doing the work that they're doing, we must also consider their humanity as an individual.
I think the American experiment as an experiment of expanding rights and autonomy has been a massive success. There's more that we can do, but the point that my book raises is it's all resting on this unexamined assumption that if you were given the opportunity and you screw up, it's optional for society to get involved in helping you. And what it creates is a society where autonomy probably works for a good chunk of the country who's middle and upper middle class and wealthy. And then there's other people that basically we spend a lot of time ignoring. I said this in a university talk locally once, which was, you know, when you run a manufacturing plant, if you actually want to have repeat customers for your ball bearings, your manufacturing defect rate better be less than 0.1%. Well, you're not going to have any repeat customers. But we tolerate a societal expulsion rate of broken people, probably to 20 to 30% at any given moment. The severely ill, mentally ill, homeless, undocumented immigrants who aren't getting treated properly because they don't have the right papers, which they can't get because we don't have a guest worker program that would just give them a formal job. So we don't look at those as important problems to solve if you look at public policy. We're much more focused on getting people opportunity and freeing them up to pursue opportunity. That's what America's really, that's our strength compared to most other countries.
That's
You know,
interesting.
and I've lived in one of them where the opportunity is even less available, right? And so I see the attraction. But again, I go back to the factory metaphor, which is how is it that we can solve these technological problems so well, which are actually really complex? Like a factory precision problem is not easy to solve. That takes lots of people, lots of hours. And we literally don't put the same kind of time and attention into how do we prevent people from starting disastrous businesses using their home equity and losing their home? How do we prevent people from becoming homeless because of one layoff that they had no control over and a cost of living that made it impossible to have savings to slip into the next apartment in a non-rent controlled city? Because that scenario right there is the majority of people who are homeless for 6 months to 12 years living out of their car. 12 months. Basically, that's it.
Interesting. I find myself, as I'm listening to you, just vacillating between the societal policy, like the political policy that you're referring to, and the individual attitude towards the problem. There's a lot there. There's a lot of nuance there, and I'm finding it is a mental ping pong in my head, which I appreciate. I appreciate that about you. So I want to go to the next kind of department, if you will, of our society in which individualism may help or hinder, and that's friendships and romantic relationships. So first, friendships. I want to talk about that because I have a therapist friend who says that the number one question that her adult clients ask her is, how do I make friends? And I wanted to ask you, what individualism attitudes or habits are keeping people from doing things or behaving in ways that allow them to make friends even when they actually do want them?
Yeah, this is a painful one because I think we're all part of the problem for sure. But when we really turn the mirror at ourselves and look at how we frame what a friend is, it reveals part of the problem. So we, for whatever reasons, we've come to see friends in adulthood as a source of entertainment. And I kind of think we learned this in college, in high school. You know, it's kind of this superficial buddy group, right? And in high school, it's kind of about actually a form about gender identity and other issues. So it doesn't seem as weird. But when we get into adulthood, we kind of still bring that same motivation, which is, you know, friends are for recreation. And I think the problem is that the easiest way to start a friendship and keep it going is actually do things for each other. The problem with the doing is a big problem for Americans because it asks of your time and it interrupts your schedule. All right. And once you really start to develop that bond, it may get really intrusive, depending on what you permit. But the weird thing is that the more reciprocity you can create between people, the stronger that bond is going to be. And that's why in kids who grow up in broken homes, the number one thing that's going on is that there's no caretaking reciprocity cycle. The parent is totally abdicated responsibility. So that the child then grows up thinking that's normal adult behavior. And that's twisted. We can understand why that's wrong. But the problem is we approach our adult friends like, I need someone to go do something with or have fun with, right? And that's the wrong question. That's the wrong question to be asking. You should be asking, who do I share values with and who do I just intrinsically want to help, and how do I help them? And then let the reciprocity start to flow. Americans favor this very, what I would call closed reciprocity cycle in relationships that aren't literally in their home. So that would be most of our friends. What do I mean by that? I mean, we say things like, if the friend gives you help, you immediately say something like, thank you, to close it off. Like, that closes the cycle. If they pay for your lunch, you zell them $15 later. That closes it off, right? Telling us that relationship isn't very intimate. We have a lot of it. And reality is that cultures which promote strong urban friendships have a much more open reciprocity cycle. And I learned this in southern India. It really shocked me. And it works like this. A friend will ask for some help, time intensive, and then you will give it. And then there's no thank you. People rarely say thank you in Tamil culture. In fact, it's almost like a middle finger. Not necessarily, but it's definitely a neutral statement. If they ever get, that means they don't want a relationship with you.
Fascinating.
So they never say it with people they care about. Because
it's
now,
like, thank you, bye-bye.
yeah, thank you and please go away. And that's because Indians are much more savvy about civilizational relationship formation and maintenance than we are. And then, I won't go into why, but it has something to do with the whole settler cowboy kind of craziness. But the open reciprocity means that when you give that help, you get the right later at a time of your choosing to ask for something to be done for you from that same person. Okay, that's direct transactional reciprocity. That terrifies Americans. Can you imagine if you help someone move into their place and then their social right is now to ask you for something unrelated to that later at a time of their choosing, and you have to drop everything and do it? And I broke this rule in India 2 or 3 times, and they got in my face.
Interesting.
I didn't recover from 2 of those relationships. They just walked by me on the street and never talked to me again.
I think I need to make more friends who are Indian. I have some thoughts that I wanted to share on this because reciprocity is a subject that I've kind of grazed over a few times on the show as it relates to friendships. And it is a struggle here because maybe now I'm realizing because of this individualism, maybe it is that underlining cowboy feeling. I cannot tell you, James, how many women that I have met that in the first 5 minutes, they tell me, oh yeah, I don't have any girlfriends. And I'm like, cool, thanks for the heads up, the warning that I also shouldn't be your friend. What is that? But they say it with a mixed sense of inquiry and pride. Look at me, I don't need any friends. It's fine. I have a husband. But also maybe you could protest and tell me how you want to be my friend. It's very uncomfortable. But because people are existing, and this is my view, so feel free to chime in when I make sense of it. Because people exist in this hardcore individualism state of being with themselves, no one is fucking listening to them. And so when you get together with these people, they trauma dump on you. And then it's not a reciprocal conversation, and it sets the tone for a non-reciprocal relationship, which, me personally, I don't want anything to do with that. So I think it continues this cycle of loneliness and, as you put it, mental health problems because of this individualistic root.
Yeah, I actually was trapped in that cycle in my 20s from a male view, but actually functioned just like you were saying, which is that as I become more alienated and more alone, I needed emotional help from friends. They don't want to, that's not how you start a friendship. You start a friendship by doing things. Now in America, the problem is we make it this sort of non-committal recreation, and that actually doesn't really yield friendships very easily. That's what my research sort of uncovered when I talk to people. What causes people to form bonds that matter and allow them to open up to people and then share a trauma in a dosed manner.
Dosed, yes.
Right? But a really wounded, alienated person actually need therapy stat, because until they get to a normative baseline, they're going to frighten everyone off, which is what you just described. I think a lot of people get stuck in that cycle. But see, that's again, where is the community looking out for people who are alienated and then providing them with what I would call mature solutions, right? And I mean, when I went to cognitive behavioral therapy, it was partly funded by my insurance, but I still had to pay about $125 a visit. That's an upper middle class solution, right? So for people like me, I could go find it, but someone else is not going to have access to them. So will they ever get reset in a baseline? Because you're right, human beings are human beings, and they can sense when someone's off kilter. We just don't get it. We just run.
Yeah.
because it's just easier not to get close to that new broken person.
Well, here's the other thing that I wanted to share with you that I'd love your opinion on, because you so beautifully disclose in your book that you have Asbergers and the challenges that brings to your life. And for me, you said people get scared that they don't want to get close to that. I get scared as an introvert, meaning a person who loses energy when they are around other humans, sadly. But I like them most of the time. It makes me tired. And so my fear is catastrophic loss of energy. And so once I get to that point, I mean, it is like a computer that is just shutting down. And I'm like, and then I'll hurt their feelings because I just can't and I need to leave.
Right.
One time I literally just had to go another place. It was loud. There was a lot of stimulus. I was overstimulated. It was a thing. So it's an energy management issue for me too. And I do have some listeners that share that quality. And there are people on the spectrum who may share similar needs that kind of reach into the realm of physical needs.
Yeah.
So how do you handle that? The results of your research and knowing how important it is to be communal, yet you have this inner thing that you're working with.
I have become my own guinea pig against my will in coming to terms with the fact that I have to take responsibility for the impact I have on others, because I didn't until I was about 35. And that's what individualism teaches you, right? It's like people, they don't like you at the office, you're pissing people off, but you're successful. The American Individualist Code says, but you're productive. So it doesn't matter if you're irritating people. You just keep trucking along, kid, right?
That's
right?
true.
And I was rewarded with promotions and everything else. A communalist society probably would have fired me early on. And that has its own callousness to it. But I think I realized I have to take responsibility for how my brain works, my limited ability to control it. And therefore, even for this interview, I sort of psych myself up for this kind of thing. So I appear mostly normal. And then I go take a nap.
You and me both,
performance.
James.
Yeah.
After I do these interviews, I also take a nap. I'm going to be virtually high-fiving you from a distance. Like, I'll send you like a little emoji high five, and you'll know what that means. You and I will have a
Yes.
code.
I just learned that I have to take responsibility for that and not brush it off like I did for 35 years. You don't make a lot of friends if you have that attitude of, which is very much my own version of being a cowboy, right? Because you have to realize in most of my life, I've had all the markers of success. Straight A's, Ivy League degrees, PhDs. I mean, on paper, I look like a mad, crazy, the next Steve Jobs. But no, it didn't turn out that way because of social skills deficits. And no one raised their hand and said, you actually have a real problem, until the CEO of my company did as I begin my book. Because there was something at stake there.
How did they say that?
I literally got hauled into a meeting, and this guy's no longer with us, but he would be an old baby boomer. And his approach was just shock and awe, because he's dealing with a stubborn male. He opened the meeting. Do you realize you're a terrible communicator? It was just it actually was very effective. I mean, it certainly got my attention. And so now I was being given like a cold water bath of self-awareness, right? That I obviously didn't have. And that started the journey of me realizing I got to take responsibility for how I behave and how I react to social, because the problem with Asperger's is the dysfunctional reaction to signals. The misinterpretation of questions as attacks, the misreading of subtle cues in language because you're stressed in real time, right? So you're not actually picking them up. In my case, it was classic inability to bullshit in a business setting. I just can't do it. I literally cannot do it. A classic example would be like a project I was on once. I came really close to blowing up at the client. That would have been the end of my job. I don't know what stopped me. I guess 18 years of being trained by my mother. Sort of something sunk in. But we had just finished focus groups, and she was this was years ago, she was demanding a verbal, off the cuff, summary, baby. Give me some cool points. And it's not how my brain works. That's not how I do research. I'm like, well, I just got out of the groups. I haven't had time to think about it. So I refused to answer, even though she's paying us a lot of money. That's a classic bullshit situation where you would literally make up bullshit on the fly. But you know what was really cool about those groups? Bullshit. And then it has nothing to do with the report later, and it doesn't really matter. Yeah. But see, I cannot. Like, what she just wanted was emotional validation. That's all she wanted. And I needed to feed her BS to make her feel like this project was going well. That was the nature of that conversation. So it's that literal mindedness that causes me to offend people. And what I've learned is that I have to limit how I interact with people, actually, for my own sanity and for their.
Yeah.
I mean, and just come to terms with that and not feel like that's some horrible thing. I'll never, I mean, another classic example of living like this, but having the world totally not get it is like in grad school, I had no friends because I was working too hard and I didn't know how to make them. I was in the Midwest and I don't get along with the culture because I'm pretty aggressive. I didn't have a girlfriend. This one guy I met was hanging out with his girlfriend in the park, and he was in a class of mine. He's like, James, you're so amazing, man. You don't need anybody. You're so great on your own. How do you do that, man? I didn't say anything in response because he had no clue that basically I was dysfunctional. That's why I was by myself.
I find it interesting that your response to navigating all of that is a radically individual, responsible methodology. Like, you know, you are taking responsibility as an individual for your state and how it affects others. And so it's interesting, like the back and forth again, the ping pong in my mind of how we're talking about the overratedness of the idea of individualism and yet its power to change society and to make a positive impression.
Yeah, I think what we're really debating and struggling with, I think, as a country and in this conversation is where are the limits of responsibility actually in every specific situation where the individual can go south. Was I responsible in grad school for getting the girlfriend and friends? Yeah, that's what America says. There's no way to help you. I mean, why? I couldn't deal with that responsibility, Meredith. I was just, because of the neurology, I was just bad at it. Mm-hmm. And there was no help. So when you're disabled in that way, and I do believe it's a disability, in this society, had I grown up in India, my wife would have been arranged for me.
Yeah.
It sounds horrible, perhaps, but to female listeners, but I mean, certainly it wouldn't matter if I was introverted or weird. I met tons of weird dorks and nerds who seem to have happy marriages. So, it's just, but in our culture, and so when I was growing up, nerds, basically, dating was a nightmare. It was a living hell because you couldn't put on a performance. I can't flirt, for example. I just cannot do it. Now, my wife happens to like those kinds of men, so I got super freaking lucky. Well, because she's more of a tomboy and she doesn't get off on, Ryan Gosling horseshit.
I love that is a category for you. Actually, you so beautifully transitioned into the final area that I wanted to discuss, which was romantic relationships, because even for people who are considered neurotypical, this spirit of individualism, it could be negatively affecting how successful they are in these romantic relationships after they do get them. For example, I have read a couple articles about, y'all should take separate vacations. And I've read, things about having different experiences, which I somewhat agree with that. But separate bank accounts, for example, like our separate health decisions, where the truth is if one partner is very ill, the other will become a caretaker. So what the other person is deciding to do or not do to take care of their health does affect the other. And yet the one partner says, well, it's his decision to drink like that and to eat like that and to never go inside of a gym. So I wonder, did you do any research on this as well? Was this at all part of your scope of study?
I should have, but I didn't have. It's very hard to survey those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And then second of all, it's also really hard to have live interviews about that with people who aren't pre-selected to be super vulnerable with random strangers, kind of like this interview.
You're doing great.
So but I'm I have a benefit to being that vulnerable. So most people aren't going to sign up for a research interview and go there. I had people disclose some really crazy stuff. That topic you're talking about takes years of relationships with people in the field. That's like really hard.
Yeah, in the field, we mean at the bar. Let's be real. Like, they have to be a little drunk.
So that's an old field site for anthropologists. I'm not supposed to say that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Dark shame. It's a dark shame of the field, but that was how it was done in the res for many decades.
Interesting.
I'm not sure I answered your question, did I?
You did. You said that you hadn't done any formal research on it. It is a hard area to study. But I think we've left listeners with some excellent thought experiments for themselves. Hopefully they are experiencing some productive ping-ponging of the brain like we've done today, like you've helped me do. Before we wrap up, are there any final thoughts you want to leave people with?
Yeah, I think in the spirit of life tips, Meredith, take a lesson from the goofball here who has to plan his social life, like plan how to execute the social life so I don't piss people off. Ask yourself the next time that you're evaluating a relationship or about to do something with someone, just stop, and when you're making plans, and just stop and say, am I just obsessed with my preferences here and what we're doing? Because this is the real problem in America with romance and friendship, and to some extent even family, is the consumer culture has just totally taken over our brain. And so we evaluate everything based on, well, how do I feel about that? Well, who cares? Maybe it's not so important. All the time. Because part of being in a relationship is you just jump up from the chair and do. And that's how the reciprocity gets fed. You don't sit there and go, well, do I really want to pause my show and help my wife? That's not going to be a long-lived relationship.
Right. Interesting.
But we're trained to do that. Oh, does this service really fit me? I should write a review and everyone cares about my opinion. And I think we should just pause. Am I just being too obsessed with my preferences that don't matter?
That's a very good life tip. Honestly, it really is. And it's simple and memorable, and there's only one. And you're not like, let me unload 12 life tips for everybody. I love that it's one tip and it's digestible. Tell people where they can find your book and stay in touch with future projects that you may have going on.
Oh, so the book's on Amazon. Just type in Our Worst Strength. It has good search results. If you want to follow along with how I think and write, I have a Substack called Homo Imaginari. So you just go to jamesrichardson.substack.com. If you like what you see there, I'd love for folks to subscribe, because I write about these kinds of things at least once a week.
Excellent. Well, thank you for doing this. This has been a really fun thought exercise.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.